Japan has a brutal history laced with war, murder, tyranny, and also cute little fun little characters. Kawaii culture took over so fast that it makes Stanley Cups shake in fear. But how did this happen, you may be asking? Well, I was wondering the same thing.
Go figure.
So I did some
research.
And the reason why Japan went from serious to kawaii in such little time, it's crazy. If you're unfamiliar with the term kawaii, then why did you click on this video? Kawaii is the Japanese term that originated from the word kawa hayushi. Kawa meaning face and hayushi meaning blushing. Mash them together, you get blushing face. That's why at first the term was used to describe embarrassment or shame. But its main use was to describe something that was pitiful, like my cock. Eventually the term morphed and changed into the affection of a superior person towards an inferior person. And thus, kawaii was born. I'm going to be saying a lot of Japanese words and I don't speak Japanese, so just ignore it. In modern times, kawaii is used to describe a lot of things. Cute animals, drawings, clothing styles, and also some things that I don't want to get into. But kawaii culture it's giant, and it's what most people think of when they think of Japan. But they shouldn't think of kawaii culture. They should instead think about the violent and graphic nature of Japan's history. If you've been keeping up with the show Shogun on Hulu, then you may be familiar with some of the more darker things that Japanese people used to do to each other. They were not very kind to each other. In fact, for a large portion of Japan's history, they were just constantly at war with each other. Pre-Edo period, it was like the Wild West, but wilder and less westier. I want to tell you about some common, light-hearted activities that they used to do in Japan. Harakiri, or seppuku, is the act of stabbing oneself in the stomach and cutting across the abdomen as a way to honorably commit suicide after doing something that they weren't proud of. They would do this for the smallest thing. I literally have no clue how anyone survived this era. Japan, as you may know, is deeply rooted in the culture of being respectful. If you so much as looked at the wrong person incorrectly, you were expected to fucking gut yourself, dude. Expected. Like, that's insane. In fact, sometimes when they cut themselves open, they would throw their own intestines out of their bodies, which is pretty fucking gnarly. And also, doesn't sound very kawaii to me. Well, if self-mutilation doesn't sound very dark to you, then how about something a little more tame? What about warfare? You like warfare? Japan was very good at fighting. So good, in fact, that the person that controlled everything was the leader of the samurai, known as the shogun. Not that bitch-ass little emperor, okay? He just sat there and ate rice all day, probably. Anyway, Japan is no stranger to warfare. In fact, Japan is responsible for one of the most disturbing atrocities of all of human history. One time in 1938, they were trying to invade China, which they tried to invade a lot of places, with literally the entirety of their military might. And you know what? I know what you're thinking. You're like, that doesn't sound so bad. That just sounds like basic war stuff. Just wait. Okay. Japan actually kicked absolute ass and eventually made their way into Nanking, which was the capital at the time. Japanese General Iwane Matsui ordered that the city of Nanking be destroyed. And when he said destroyed, he fucking meant it. Japanese troops butchered an estimated 150,000 male war prisoners, massacred 50,000 male civilians, and raped at least 20,000 women and girls, many of whom were also killed. It was horrible. It was really bad. And it still causes issues to this day between China and Japan. Wow, that killed the mood. Let's talk about kawaii stuff now. So the agreed upon first kawaii character appeared in 1938, which, you know, was the same time that stuff was happening. Named Kurumi-chan. Created by artist Katsuji Matsumoto, Kurumi-chan is a little girl with a big fucking head. Her main characteristics were her big eyes and her teensy little nose. The building blocks of what would eventually become synonymous with the kawaii aesthetic. Katsuji's artwork, as well as Junichi Nakahara's artwork, would inspire many other artists to play around with like bigger, cuter proportions. And that was actually one of the first breakoffs from traditional Japanese artworks and styles. But this art style didn't actually really blow up at all in the beginning. It wasn't popular. It would take something big to make that happen. What was that big thing? World War II. It was World War II. After the atomic bombs were dropped and Japan lost the war, Japan was really weak and very unstable. The only thing at the time it could latch onto was the thing that destroyed it. The US began aiding Japan under the means that Japan wasn't allowed to attack the US anymore. And because of this, a lot of westernization started happening in Japan. Most notably, the media. The biggest and most successful Western media in Japan were the animated Walt Disney films. These movies completely changed a lot of Japanese artists' like perspective on animation and art. They would eventually take Western stories like Alice in Wonderland and make characters cuter with big ol' eyes and teensy little noses. The biggest and arguably the most important kawaii influencer of the time was Rune Naito. He created magazines that focused on femininity and cuteness, with again the characters sporting giant heads and giant eyeballs. But his characters looked pleasing to the eye, unlike something like Big Mouth characters. Well, most of his characters looked good. He was also the one that started drawing like strawberries and other fruits in the cutesy kawaii style, which is actually like why strawberries are still huge in kawaii art, which is pretty cool. The 1950s and 60s were also the time when manga started to really start getting some attention, specifically manga that was attempting to appeal to the female audience. They started making stories revolving around women and included a lot of kawaii imagery. However, the weird thing is that the magazines were a giant fucking failure for years, decades, actually. Most women just didn't adhere to the magazines because, if we're being honest, all of the stories were being written from a man's perspective, so they didn't give a fuck. It wasn't until the 1970s when actual women started writing stories that female audiences could actually resonate with. This is also around the time when Japanese women started not giving a fuck about trying to look like American women. They started to want to look cuter, more kawaii even. Partially because they wanted to appear more innocent so that they would increase their sex appeal as a potential marriage partner. So clothing, makeup, hairstyles, everything started to change into this kawaii aesthetic. The 70s was also when Hello Kitty was invented or created or drawn, and Hello Kitty rose in popularity and became the icon in the kawaii space. Pop music all of a sudden was filled with kawaii imagery, and pop idols began to expand kawaii culture even more. When the 1980s came around, kawaii culture started to like cement itself into the mainstream. It was everywhere. Billboards, book bags, road signs, pencils, literally anywhere you looked, you would see something kawaii. Whether you liked it or not, kawaii was the norm. So in less than half a century, Japan went from literally being in cahoot with the Nazis to a culture obsessed with Hello Kitty and manga. Pretty wild, man. Legitimately one of, if not the craziest switch-ups in human history. By the way, I'm aware that most of Japan is not as kawaii as Tokyo. Okay, I get that. It's just so different and fun that I wanted to talk about it, and there you go. If you like what you see, then you should go ahead and click on one of these videos right here. They're pretty cool. Yeah. Okay, bye.